Lady Margaret Whitmore had served the royal household for 37 years, yet she still felt her heart skip a beat each time she entered the grand dining room of Buckingham Palace. The morning light filtered through the towering windows, casting golden shadows across the mahogany table that could seat 24 guests comfortably. Today, however, only 5 places were set for the weekly family breakfast that had become both tradition and battleground. She adjusted the final piece of silverware with practiced precision, knowing that every fork, knife, and spoon had its exact position according to centuries-old protocol. What the public never understood, what even most palace staff remained unaware of, was that this dining room served as more than just a place for meals. It was a complex stage where emotions played out through the language of subtle gestures, carefully placed utensils, and meaningful silences. Margaret had learned this secret language gradually, watching as 3 generations of royals communicated their deepest feelings without ever speaking a word about them directly. The dining table had witnessed heartbreak, reconciliation, anger, and forgiveness, all expressed through a vocabulary known only to those who lived within these ancient walls. The Queen Mother had been the first to teach Margaret about the signals, though neither of them had called it that at the time. It was during the difficult years when Prince Charles's marriage to Diana was crumbling, and the palace was thick with tension that no amount of proper etiquette could disguise. Margaret had been arranging flowers that morning when the Queen Mother approached her with an unusual request. "Margaret, dear," the elderly woman had said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating royal protocol. "I need you to watch how we handle our napkins today at luncheon. There are things that must be communicated, and words sometimes fail us in this family." That afternoon, Margaret observed as the Queen Mother folded her linen napkin into a perfect triangle before placing it beside her plate, rather than on her lap, as convention dictated. Within moments, Prince Charles mirrored the action, and Margaret realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. A conversation was taking place without a single word being spoken about the subject that was tearing the family apart. Over the years, Margaret had cataloged these signals in her mind, creating an informal encyclopedia of royal emotional communication. When Princess Anne placed her knife perpendicular to her plate during the soup course, she was expressing frustration with palace politics. When Prince Andrew left his wine glass untouched throughout an entire meal, he was signaling his disagreement with a family decision. When the Queen herself moved her salt cellar 3 inches to the left of its traditional position, she was indicating her displeasure with recent media coverage. The signals had evolved into an intricate system of communication that allowed the royal family to maintain their public facade while still expressing their human emotions. It was a language born of necessity, developed by people who could never afford to show vulnerability in public, yet who desperately needed ways to connect with each other as a family. As Margaret finished her preparations that morning, she couldn't help but reflect on how this silent language had become both a blessing and a curse for the royals. It allowed them to communicate when words were too dangerous or too painful, but it also created a distance that sometimes made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. She had watched young princes and princesses learn these signals before they could properly tie their shoes, inheriting a vocabulary of emotional restraint that would shape their relationships for life. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of the first family member. Margaret straightened her apron and took her position near the serving station, preparing to witness another chapter in the ongoing emotional drama that played out daily in this room. Prince William entered first, as had become his custom since taking on more royal duties. His shoulders carried a tension that Margaret recognized immediately, and she watched carefully as he approached his designated seat. The way he paused before sitting down, the slight hesitation as he reached for his water glass, told her that today would bring difficult conversations, even if they remained unspoken. William's relationship with the dining room signals had always been complicated. As a child, he had been slow to learn them, preferring direct communication that his royal education gradually trained out of him. Margaret remembered the day when 8-year-old William had burst into tears at this very table, frustrated by his inability to understand why his parents were angry with each other when their voices remained perfectly pleasant throughout the meal. "Why don't they just say what they mean?" he had asked Margaret later, when she found him hiding in the palace gardens. She had knelt beside him, searching for words that could explain a system she was only beginning to understand herself. "Sometimes, young prince," she had said carefully, "the most important things are too big for words. Your family has found other ways to show love and concern, ways that keep everyone safe from the people who watch everything you do." It had taken years for William to master the subtle art his family practiced, and even now, as a grown man with children of his own, Margaret could see him struggling against the constraints it imposed. There was a natural warmth in his character that fought against the formal distance these signals sometimes required. Catherine entered next, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. She had adapted to the royal communication style with remarkable grace, though Margaret knew it hadn't come naturally to her. The Duchess had grown up in a family where emotions were expressed openly, where disagreements were discussed rather than signaled through the placement of bread rolls. Margaret had been present during Catherine's first formal family dinner after her engagement to William, and she had watched the young woman's confusion as the meal progressed. Every attempt Catherine made at normal conversation was met with polite responses that somehow managed to convey entirely different meanings through accompanying gestures. By the end of the evening, Catherine had looked exhausted from trying to decode a language she didn't yet speak. The learning process had been difficult for Catherine, and Margaret had observed many private moments where the future Duchess practiced the signals alone, rehearsing the placement of utensils and the timing of specific gestures. There was something both admirable and heartbreaking about watching someone learn to suppress their natural communication style in service of tradition. Yet Catherine had also brought something new to the family's silent language. She had introduced subtle modifications that allowed for more warmth and affection to be expressed within the traditional framework. The way she might lightly touch the stem of her wine glass while making eye contact across the table had become her signature way of offering support and encouragement to family members who were struggling. King Charles arrived precisely on time, as he had done for decades. His mastery of the dining room signals was complete and unconscious, developed over a lifetime of practice. Margaret could read his emotional state in the way he approached his chair, the angle at which he placed his morning newspaper beside his plate, the specific pattern in which he arranged his breakfast condiments. This morning, his signals indicated a mixture of concern and determination. The newspaper was folded to display a specific headline about royal finances, placed at an angle that suggested he wanted the family to notice it without him having to mention it directly. His salt and pepper shakers were positioned closer together than usual, a sign that he felt the family needed to present a united front in the face of public scrutiny. Margaret had served Charles through some of the most difficult periods of his life, and she had watched him use these signals to navigate impossible situations. During the divorce proceedings with Diana, when every word spoken in the palace might find its way into tabloid headlines, the dining room had become his primary venue for family communication. He had developed an elaborate system for expressing his pain, his confusion, and his hopes for reconciliation, all through the careful orchestration of mealtime rituals. The Queen had been the absolute master of this silent language, and Charles had learned from watching her navigate decades of family crises without ever breaking her public composure. Margaret remembered how Elizabeth could convey volumes about her state of mind through the simple act of buttering her toast, or how she might signal her approval or disapproval of family decisions through the timing of her tea consumption. Princess and entered last, bringing with her the no-nonsense energy that characterized everything she did. Her approach to the family's communication system was refreshingly direct, even within its constraints. She had never embraced the more elaborate aspects of the signal system, preferring straightforward gestures that left little room for misinterpretation, and signals that morning indicated impatience with palace politics and a desire to focus on more practical matters. She placed her mobile phone face down beside her plate, a modern addition to the traditional signal vocabulary that meant she considered the upcoming conversation more important than any outside interruptions. Her napkin was folded with military precision, suggesting she was prepared for serious discussion. As the 5 family members settled into their seats, Margaret began serving the first course while keeping careful track of the emotional undercurrents flowing through their silent communications. The placement of each utensil, the timing of each sip of coffee, the angle at which newspapers were positioned, all of it contributed to a complex conversation that was already well underway before the first words were spoken. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating a scene that would have appeared perfectly normal to any casual observer. A family sharing breakfast, discussing the day ahead in quiet, civilized tones. But Margaret knew better. She understood that beneath the surface of polite conversation, an intricate emotional dialogue was taking place through signals developed over generations of royal tradition. She had become fluent in this language through decades of observation, and she recognized that today's breakfast would address several ongoing family concerns. The positioning of utensils suggested discussions about public appearances and family unity. The careful arrangement of personal items indicated that private disagreements needed to be resolved. Most importantly, the subtle modifications each family member had made to their traditional signal patterns suggested that changes were coming to the royal household, changes that would need to be navigated with all the diplomatic skill their silent language could provide. As Margaret stepped back to allow the family their privacy, she reflected on the unique privilege of her position. She was one of the few people in the world who truly understood how this most public of families maintained their emotional connections despite the enormous pressures they faced. The dining room signals were more than just a curiosity of royal protocol. They were a testament to the human need for connection and understanding, expressed through whatever means available, even when words themselves had become too dangerous to use freely. The breakfast conversation began with the usual pleasantries about the weather and upcoming engagements, but Margaret could see the real communication happening through the careful choreography of gestures taking place around the table. Prince William had positioned his coffee cup at the far right of his setting, a signal that he had concerns about family matters that needed to be addressed privately. His father noticed immediately and responded by moving his own newspaper slightly to the left, indicating he was prepared to listen. Catherine's adaptation to this complex system had been remarkable to witness over the years. Margaret remembered the early days when the future Duchess would arrive at family meals with small notes written on her palm, reminders of what different signal combinations meant. Now, years later, she moved through the silent language with natural grace, though Margaret could still see moments when her true feelings fought against the restraint the system required. This morning, Catherine placed her orange juice glass at the precise center of her place setting, a signal she had developed to indicate that she had information to share about the children's well-being. It was a mother's addition to the traditional vocabulary, born from her need to communicate about her children's emotional needs without exposing them to public scrutiny. The signal system had evolved significantly since Margaret first learned of its existence. What had begun as simple gestures to avoid uncomfortable conversations had grown into a sophisticated method of family governance. Different combinations of signals could indicate everything from disagreement with palace advisors to concerns about media coverage, from personal health issues to worries about the monarchy's future. King Charles had inherited not just the crown from his mother, but also the responsibility of maintaining this invisible family language. Margaret had observed him during the difficult transition period, watching as he adapted signals that had served his mother's reign to meet the needs of his own. The Queen had used the system primarily to maintain family harmony during public crises. Charles was using it to navigate the more complex challenge of modernizing an ancient institution while preserving its essential character. His breakfast routine this morning included several signals that Margaret recognized as preparations for difficult decisions. The way he arranged his morning medications beside his plate indicated that he was dealing with stress-related health concerns. The specific pattern in which he folded his morning correspondence suggested that palace advisors had presented him with options he found unsatisfactory. Most significantly, the way he positioned his reading glasses indicated that he planned to make announcements that would affect the entire family. Princess Anne's impatience with elaborate protocol extended to her use of the family signal system. She had always preferred direct action to subtle communication, and her signals reflected this preference. When she placed her watch face up beside her plate, she was telling her family that she considered their conversation to have a time limit. When she arranged her silverware in perfectly parallel lines, she was indicating that she wanted to focus on practical solutions rather than emotional discussions. Margaret had great respect for Anne's approach to family communication. While other family members sometimes used the signal system to avoid difficult conversations and use it to ensure that important matters were addressed efficiently, her signals this morning indicated that she had specific recommendations for handling whatever crisis had prompted this family meeting. The conversation around the table remained focused on routine matters, upcoming charity events, scheduling conflicts, and logistical concerns. But the real discussion was happening through the careful placement of personal items and the timing of specific gestures. William's frequent adjustments to his napkin position indicated his ongoing concern about how palace decisions affected his children's privacy. Catherine's subtle modifications to her traditional signals suggested she was trying to find ways to make royal life more accessible to the public without compromising family safety. Margaret had learned to read these conversations like a complex musical score, understanding how different signal patterns created harmonies and discordances within the family dynamic. She could see when family members were in agreement, when they were struggling with internal conflicts, and when they needed time to process information before responding. The emotional weight of communicating through signals had taken its toll on every generation of royals Margaret had served. She remembered Princess Diana's frustration with the system, how the young woman had initially tried to ignore the traditional signals in favor of direct emotional expression. The conflict between Diana's natural communication style and the royal family's indirect methods had created tensions that extended far beyond the dining room. William had inherited his mother's preference for emotional honesty, but he had also learned from watching her struggles with royal protocol. His use of the signal system reflected this complex inheritance. He participated in the traditional communications while trying to create space for more authentic expression within family relationships. Catherine's background as a commoner had initially made her an outsider to the signal system, but it had also given her a unique perspective on its effects. She had experienced both sides of royal communication, the warmth of families who spoke openly about their feelings, and the careful restraint required in royal households. Her modifications to traditional signals often reflected her attempts to bridge these two worlds. The morning light shifted as clouds passed over the palace, and Margaret noticed how this change affected the mood around the dining table. The family's use of signals was influenced by many factors: the time of day, the season, current events, and even the weather. Bright sunlight encouraged more optimistic signal patterns, while gray skies seemed to bring out the more cautious and protective aspects of their communication. Charles lifted his teacup in a specific pattern that Margaret recognized as a signal for family unity. It was a gesture his mother had often used during times of crisis, a way of reminding everyone at the table that they shared common interests despite their individual concerns. The response from his children was immediate and coordinated. William adjusted his posture to indicate agreement. Catherine moved her water glass to show support, and even nodded slightly to acknowledge the message. These moments of synchronized communication were among the most beautiful aspects of the signal system. When the family functioned as a harmonious unit, their silent language became like a carefully choreographed dance, with each member contributing to a larger pattern of meaning and connection. Margaret had witnessed the signal system's power to heal relationships as well as strain them. She remembered a particularly difficult period when William and Charles had been at odds over palace modernization plans. For weeks, their signals had indicated growing frustration and misunderstanding. Then, gradually, she had watched as they used the same system to find common ground, developing new signal patterns that acknowledged both perspectives and allowed them to work toward compromise. The psychological impact of growing up within this communication system fascinated Margaret. She had watched royal children learn to suppress their immediate emotional reactions in favor of calculated responses. They developed an almost supernatural ability to maintain composure under pressure, but sometimes at the cost of spontaneous emotional expression. William's children were now learning their own versions of the family signal system, adapted for their generation and modified by their parents' desire to maintain some emotional authenticity within royal constraints. Margaret had observed young Prince George practicing the placement of his dessert spoon during informal family meals, learning that even small gestures could carry meaning in royal life. The evolution of the signal system reflected broader changes in British society and the monarchy's role within it. Earlier generations of royals had used the system primarily to maintain dignity during personal crises that might threaten the crown's reputation. The current generation was adapting it to navigate the challenges of being both public figures and private individuals in an age of constant media scrutiny. Social media had added new complications to the royal communication system. Every public appearance was now recorded and analyzed by millions of people around the world. The family's traditional signals had to be modified to account for the fact that their private gestures might be captured and misinterpreted by observers who didn't understand context. Catherine had been particularly innovative in adapting the signal system for the digital age. She had developed ways to use fashion choices and public gestures to send supportive messages to family members without creating tabloid speculation. A particular choice of jewelry might indicate solidarity with a family member facing criticism. The timing of a public appearance could signal support for a controversial royal decision. As the breakfast conversation continued, Margaret noted several signals indicating that major announcements were being planned. The coordination between Charles and his children suggested that they had been discussing significant changes to royal protocols or public roles. The specific patterns of their gestures indicated that these changes would affect not just the immediate family, but the broader structure of the monarchy. And signals had shifted throughout the meal, indicating that she was processing information and forming responses to her family's proposals. Her initial impatience had given way to thoughtful consideration, and Margaret could see her moving toward agreement with whatever plans were being discussed. The signal system had always been most powerful during moments of crisis or transition, when the family needed to coordinate their response to challenging circumstances while maintaining public confidence in the monarchy. Margaret had observed the system in action during royal deaths, scandals, divorces, and political controversies. Each crisis had led to refinements and adaptations in the family's communication methods. What struck Margaret most about the current generation's use of the signal system was their attempt to balance tradition with accessibility. They were working to maintain the protective aspects of indirect communication while finding ways to be more emotionally available to each other and to the public. It was a delicate balance that required constant adjustment and remarkable skill. The breakfast was drawing to a close, and Margaret could see the family beginning to signal their preparations for departure. But first, there was one final exchange of gestures that indicated resolution of the morning's discussions. Charles moved his reading glasses to their traditional position, indicating satisfaction with the family's decisions. William's response showed his willingness to support whatever had been agreed upon. Catherine's final signal suggested confidence in their collective choice. Anne's gesture indicated her typical readiness to move from discussion to action. As Margaret began clearing the table, she reflected on the remarkable conversation she had just witnessed. Without ever directly discussing the specific issues that concerned them, the royal family had managed to share information, express emotions, debate options, and reach consensus. It was a testament to the sophisticated communication system they had developed over generations of royal service, and to their commitment to finding ways to remain connected as a family despite the extraordinary pressures of their public roles. 3 weeks after that pivotal breakfast, Margaret noticed significant changes in the family's dining room dynamics. The signals had evolved to accommodate new decisions that had clearly been made during their silent conversation, and she found herself documenting these adaptations in her private journal each evening. The royal household was entering a period of transition, and the family's communication system was adjusting to meet new challenges. Prince William's signals had become more confident and decisive, reflecting his increased responsibilities within the family structure. Margaret observed him taking on signal patterns that had previously been his father's domain, indicating his preparation for future leadership roles. The way he now positioned his morning correspondence suggested he was receiving briefings on matters of state. His coffee ritual had evolved to include gestures that showed his comfort with making difficult decisions that affected not just his immediate family, but the entire monarchy. The most remarkable change was in how William now used signals to bridge the gap between traditional royal protocol and modern family life. He had developed new gesture patterns that allowed him to communicate about his children's needs while maintaining the protective distance the signal system provided. When he arranged his breakfast utensils in a specific pattern, he was indicating concerns about how royal duties might affect his children's normal development. When he moved his water glass to the left of his plate, he was suggesting that family decisions should prioritize the next generation's well-being. Catherine had embraced her role as a modernizing influence within the traditional signal framework. Margaret watched with admiration as the Duchess created new ways to express maternal concerns and family unity through the ancient language of royal dining etiquette. She had introduced subtle modifications that allowed for more warmth and emotional support to be communicated between family members, while still maintaining the protective formality that royal life required. One of Catherine's most significant contributions was her development of signals that could convey reassurance and encouragement during difficult periods. The way she might lightly touch the rim of her teacup while making eye contact with a family member had become recognized as a gesture of support and solidarity. Her placement of flowers at specific positions on the table could indicate her confidence in family decisions or a concern about external pressures. Margaret had been particularly moved by watching Catherine develop signals related to her role as a mother within the royal family. The Duchess had created a complex vocabulary of gestures that allowed her to discuss her children's emotional needs, educational concerns, and social development without exposing them to public scrutiny. A particular arrangement of her jewelry could indicate pride in her children's achievements. The timing of her arrival at family meals could signal concerns about their adaptation to royal expectations. King Charles had grown more comfortable with his role as the family's emotional anchor, and his signals reflected this increased confidence. Margaret noticed that he was using fewer protective gestures and more inclusive ones, indicating his desire to create unity within the family during this period of change. His morning routine now included signals that showed his appreciation for his children's support and his confidence in their ability to handle increased responsibilities. The king's approach to the signal system had matured significantly since his early days of learning from his mother. Where he had once used signals primarily to navigate personal crises, he now employed them to guide family governance and long-term planning. His gestures indicated strategic thinking about the monarchy's future and careful consideration of how family decisions would affect public perception. Margaret observed that Charles was using the signal system to gradually transfer certain responsibilities to William, creating a smooth transition that allowed both men to maintain their dignity while acknowledging changing roles. The way Charles positioned his official papers during meals now often mirrored William's arrangement, indicating shared authority and mutual respect for each other's judgment. Princess Anne's role within the family communication system had evolved to that of a wise counselor, and her signals reflected this position. Margaret noticed that and was using fewer impatience indicators and more supportive gestures, suggesting her growing comfort with the family's direction under Charles's leadership. Her straightforward approach to the signal system had become an asset in helping the family maintain clarity about their goals and priorities. And signals increasingly served as reality checks for the family's more elaborate communication patterns. When discussions became too abstract or emotions too complicated, her direct gestures brought conversations back to practical considerations and actionable solutions. She had developed a reputation for using signals that cut through diplomatic language to address core issues that needed attention. The practical changes in the family's circumstances had required adjustments to their traditional signal vocabulary. New responsibilities meant new concerns, and the signal system had to expand to accommodate discussions about constitutional matters, international relations, and governmental collaboration. Margaret watched as the family developed signals for communicating about sensitive political issues that could not be discussed openly, even within the privacy of palace walls. One of the most significant developments was the creation of signals specifically related to public appearances and media management. The royal family had always been conscious of their public image, but the modern media environment required more sophisticated coordination of their public messaging. Margaret observed the development of gesture patterns that allowed family members to coordinate their responses to public events and ensure consistency in their public statements. Catherine had been instrumental in developing signals related to charitable work and public engagement. Her background in public relations had given her insights into effective communication strategies, and she had adapted these skills to fit within the royal signal system. The way she arranged her charitable correspondence during family meals could indicate opportunities for coordinated public appearances. Her selection of specific jewelry pieces could signal her recommendations for emphasizing particular causes or initiatives. The emotional toll of constant public scrutiny had led to the development of signals specifically designed to provide psychological support to family members during difficult periods. Margaret had watched the family create gesture patterns that could convey empathy, encouragement, and solidarity without requiring verbal discussion of sensitive topics. William had become particularly skilled at using supportive signals when family members were facing media criticism or public controversy. His ability to communicate understanding and encouragement through subtle gestures had become invaluable in helping the family maintain unity during challenging times. The way he might adjust his napkin placement could indicate his recognition of a family member's struggles. His choice of conversation topics during meals could signal his commitment to providing emotional support. The signal system had also adapted to accommodate the family's relationships with palace staff and advisors. Margaret noticed that family members had developed ways to communicate about staff performance, advisory recommendations, and administrative decisions through their dining room gestures. This allowed them to coordinate their management approaches without having sensitive discussions that might be overheard by other staff members. Charles had become particularly adept at using signals to communicate his evaluation of palace advisors and their recommendations. The way he positioned his briefing papers could indicate his confidence in specific proposals. His treatment of correspondence during meals could signal his priorities for palace administration. These subtle communications allowed the family to maintain unified leadership approaches while respecting the professional relationships that kept the royal household functioning effectively. The integration of technology into royal life had required new signal adaptations. Margaret observed the family developing gesture patterns related to their use of mobile phones, tablets, and other digital devices during family time. These signals allowed them to balance their need for constant communication with advisors and staff against their desire to maintain family intimacy during private meals. Catherine had been creative in developing signals that incorporated modern communication tools. The way she positioned her mobile phone during meals could indicate the urgency of external communications. Her use of digital devices could signal her availability for family discussion versus her need to attend to official business. These adaptations showed how the traditional signal system could evolve to meet contemporary challenges. The family's use of signals during international travel and state visits had become increasingly sophisticated. Margaret had learned about these adaptations through conversations with staff members who accompanied the family on official trips. The signal system provided a way for family members to coordinate their responses to diplomatic situations while maintaining the formal distance required in international settings. William and Catherine had developed particularly effective signals for managing their children's behavior during public appearances. These gesture patterns allowed them to provide guidance and support to their children without creating public spectacles or embarrassing situations. The subtlety of these communications demonstrated the family's commitment to protecting their children while preparing them for their future roles. As Margaret reflected on the evolution of the royal family's communication system, she was struck by how it had become both more sophisticated and more emotionally supportive over time. What had begun as a protective mechanism to avoid public embarrassment had grown into a comprehensive method for maintaining family unity while managing the complex demands of modern royal life. The current generation of royals had inherited a communication system developed over centuries, but they had not simply accepted it unchanged. Instead, they had adapted it to meet their own needs and values, creating a more emotionally responsive version of traditional royal protocol. This evolution reflected their commitment to preserving essential aspects of monarchy while making it more accessible and relevant to contemporary society. Margaret realized that her position as an observer of this communication system had given her unique insights into the human cost of royal life and the remarkable ways that families could adapt to extraordinary circumstances. The signal system was more than just an interesting curiosity. It was a testament to human creativity in finding ways to maintain emotional connections despite seemingly impossible constraints. 6 months later, Margaret found herself preparing for what she sensed would be her final formal documentation of the royal family's dining room communication system. After nearly 4 decades of service, she had been offered an honored retirement, and the knowledge she carried about the family's secret language would soon need to be carefully passed to her successor. The weight of this responsibility had been keeping her awake at night, as she struggled to find ways to teach someone else the subtle nuances she had spent decades learning to recognize. The family's signal system had reached a new level of sophistication during the recent months, evolving into something that resembled a form of emotional telepathy more than simple communication. Margaret had watched William and Catherine develop the ability to have entire conversations through barely perceptible gestures, coordinating their responses to complex family situations without ever speaking directly about sensitive topics. Their children were beginning to learn simplified versions of these signals, creating a new generation of royals who would grow up bilingual in both spoken English and the silent language of royal dining etiquette. King Charles had fully embraced his role as the keeper of family traditions, but his approach to the signal system reflected his desire to modernize the monarchy while preserving its essential character. Margaret observed him developing new signal patterns that incorporated environmental concerns, technological adaptations, and international diplomatic considerations. His breakfast ritual now included gestures that indicated his thinking about climate change initiatives, his evaluation of digital communication strategies, and his assessment of the monarchy's role in global politics. The king's signals had become more paternal and inclusive as he settled into his role, showing less of the defensive positioning that had characterized his communications during his years as heir. Margaret noticed that his gesture patterns now emphasized family unity and collective decision-making, indicating his desire to rule through collaboration rather than traditional hierarchical authority. When he arranged his morning medications in specific patterns, he was no longer signaling personal stress, but rather his commitment to maintaining his health for the sake of his royal duties. Princess Anne had assumed an even more prominent role as the family's practical advisor, and her signals had evolved to reflect this increased influence. Margaret watched as and developed gesture patterns that could efficiently summarize complex political situations and recommend specific courses of action. Her straightforward approach to communication had become invaluable in helping the family navigate increasingly complicated public and private challenges. And signals during recent family meals had indicated her growing concern about the long-term sustainability of royal traditions in a rapidly changing world. The way she positioned her reading glasses suggested her careful study of public opinion polls and demographic changes. Her arrangement of official correspondence showed her analysis of how different royal approaches might affect future public support for the monarchy. The most remarkable development had been the creation of signals specifically designed to support the emotional well-being of family members during periods of intense public scrutiny. Margaret had watched the family develop an intricate system of gestures that could provide psychological support, practical advice, and strategic guidance without requiring vulnerable family members to articulate their needs directly. Catherine had become the master of these supportive communications, developing signal patterns that could convey everything from maternal encouragement to strategic public relations advice. Her placement of personal items during family meals had evolved into a sophisticated method for offering guidance to family members who were struggling with public criticism or personal challenges. When she arranged her jewelry in specific patterns, she was indicating her availability to provide private support after the meal concluded. Margaret had been particularly moved by watching Catherine develop signals related to her role as a bridge between the royal family and the general public. The Duchess had created gesture patterns that allowed her to share insights about public sentiment and recommend approaches for improving the monarchy's connection with ordinary citizens. Her background as a commoner continued to inform her contributions to family discussions, even though those contributions were now expressed through the refined language of royal dining protocol. The family's approach to managing their children's introduction to public life had required the development of entirely new signal categories. Margaret observed William and Catherine creating gesture patterns that allowed them to coordinate their parenting strategies while maintaining the protective distance that royal children needed from public attention. These signals enabled them to discuss their children's educational needs, social development, and emotional adjustment without exposing private family matters to potential public scrutiny. Young Prince George had begun showing remarkable aptitude for understanding the family's communication system, though his parents were careful to ensure that his childhood remained as normal as possible within royal constraints. Margaret had watched him unconsciously mirror his parents' gesture patterns during formal family meals, suggesting that he was absorbing the signal vocabulary even without formal instruction. His ability to remain calm and composed during public appearances already reflected the emotional control that the signal system helped develop in royal family members. The integration of charitable work into the family's communication system had created new opportunities for coordinated public service while maintaining personal privacy about family motivations and concerns. Margaret observed the development of signals that allowed family members to coordinate their charitable initiatives, share information about effective approaches, and support each other's work without creating public competition or confusion about royal priorities. Charles had developed particularly sophisticated signals related to his environmental advocacy, allowing him to communicate his passion for climate change issues while maintaining the political neutrality required of the monarchy. His gesture patterns during family meals could indicate opportunities for environmental initiatives, express his frustration with governmental inaction, or signal his pride in successful conservation projects, all while maintaining plausible deniability about any political implications. The family's use of signals to manage their relationships with governmental officials and political leaders had become increasingly important as the monarchy's constitutional role evolved in the modern democratic system. Margaret had learned about these developments through her conversations with senior palace staff who attended state functions and diplomatic meetings. The signal system provided a way for family members to coordinate their approaches to sensitive political situations while maintaining their constitutional obligations to remain above partisan politics. William's preparation for eventual kingship had led to the development of signals specifically related to constitutional monarchy and democratic governance. Margaret noticed that his gesture patterns increasingly reflected his study of governmental processes, his evaluation of political trends, and his preparation for the complex constitutional role he would eventually inherit. His signals showed growing confidence in his ability to serve as a unifying figure for the British people while respecting democratic institutions. The emotional maturity that the signal system had helped develop in family members was perhaps its most valuable contribution to royal effectiveness. Margaret had watched several generations of royals learn to process complex emotions without losing their public composure, to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by personal feelings, and to maintain family relationships despite enormous external pressures. Catherine's adaptation to royal life had demonstrated the system's power to help individuals develop emotional resilience while maintaining their essential humanity. Margaret had watched her learn to use signals not just to communicate with family members, but to manage her own emotional responses to the challenges of royal life. The Duchess had developed gesture patterns that helped her process stress, maintain confidence during criticism, and find strength in family support systems. The technological challenges of modern royal life had required adaptations that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Margaret observed the family developing signals related to social media management, digital privacy concerns, and online reputation protection. These modern challenges required the same careful coordination that traditional royal communications had always demanded, but with new complexities created by instantaneous global communication. The family's ability to maintain emotional connections despite their public roles had been strengthened by their sophisticated communication system. Margaret realized that the signals had evolved far beyond their original purpose of avoiding embarrassing conversations. They had become a method for deepening family relationships, supporting individual growth, and maintaining collective strength during challenging periods. As Margaret prepared for her retirement, she reflected on the privilege of having witnessed the evolution of this remarkable communication system. She had seen it serve as a protective mechanism during family crises, a coordination tool during public challenges, and a bonding experience that had strengthened family relationships across multiple generations. The signal system had demonstrated the human capacity for adaptation and creativity in maintaining emotional connections despite seemingly impossible constraints. Her successor would inherit not just knowledge about gesture patterns and protocol arrangements, but responsibility for supporting a family communication system that had become essential to modern royal life. Margaret had prepared detailed documentation of the signals she had observed, but she knew that the most important aspects of the system could only be learned through years of patient observation and gradual understanding. The royal family's silent dining signals had taught Margaret that human beings could find ways to communicate love, support, concern, and guidance even when words were too dangerous or inadequate for the task. The system had shown her that families could maintain deep emotional connections while managing extraordinary public responsibilities, and that tradition could evolve to meet contemporary challenges without losing its essential character. As she watched the family prepare for another formal breakfast, Margaret felt profound gratitude for having been trusted with knowledge about their private emotional lives. The signal system had revealed the humanity behind the royal facade, showing her that even the most public families needed private ways to care for each other and navigate the complexities of their unique circumstances. The morning light streamed through the dining room windows one final time during Margaret's tenure, illuminating a family that had learned to speak volumes through the careful placement of teacups and the subtle timing of gentle gestures. Their silent language would continue to evolve long after Margaret's retirement, adapting to meet new challenges while preserving the essential human need for family connection and emotional support. The royal dining room would remain a stage for this ancient and sophisticated form of communication, ensuring that future generations of royals would have the tools they needed to maintain their humanity while serving their extraordinary public roles.